So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Welcome to our first Beyond the Blues event of 2022. So Beyond the Blues education and screening days are held across BC each fall and winter and serve the purpose of helping to support people's mental wellness. If you wish to learn more about Beyond the Blues events, we can provide you with their website at the end of this presentation. Before we get too far along though, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that I am grateful to live on the traditional ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam nations. Before I pass over this event to Danny, I would like to review a couple of housekeeping items and provide a brief introduction to those who have created this event tonight. So first, this presentation will be recorded, as I noted earlier, for everyone's viewing later. So don't worry about your cameras. We can't see anyone's faces or hear anyone's voices, just the people on the right-hand side here, the panelists and the speakers. And second, our presenter will be covering a number of points during his presentation, but he will be leaving space at the end to answer any questions or comments that come up during the presentation. So what I will do at the end, once we have come to a close, I'm going to share a link for a feedback form in the chat box. If you could just click on that link, it will just take a few minutes of your time to provide some feedback, and then we will continue with the Q&A portion or any questions, comments that you have for our group here tonight. I will also quickly introduce you to the people that are joining us here. So first we have Nicole Chan. She is the clinician for supporting families. We also have Barbara Fee and myself, Pascal Gendrell, representing Pathways Clubhouse, namely the public education program. And as well our speaker, Danny Taylor. Danny is a longtime community supporter, having recently completed a 14-year career as an addiction prevention specialist here in Richmond. He has had the privilege of working with children, youth, young adults, adults and families for more than 20 years, and now runs his own private practice as a registered clinical counselor. If you are interested in learning more about Danny's private practice, we will be providing you with the link, the Ocean Counseling, so you can check that out afterwards. And now the person everyone's been waiting for, Danny Taylor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Pascal. And good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be able to join you and to get an opportunity to speak with you. And it's very curious in these days that we do this through Zoom. I mean, there's advantages that you maybe are in the comfort of your home, but I do miss the opportunity to actually be with you in a shared space. But I'm looking forward to sharing some information with you tonight on parenting and supporting adolescents, teenagers. And I think that this will be a useful perspective. I was saying to the panelists that when I was preparing this, it struck me, I have a 3.5-year-old and a 1-year-old at home, that as much as I don't have teenagers in my parenthood yet, this is a parenting journey. And I think that there's some really good information here that can be useful. And as Pascal mentioned, really hope for some opportunity for Q&A at the end. If you have questions, feel free to jot those into the Q&A or the comment box, the chat box, and hopefully I can give a response to those. And having a PowerPoint is useful when we're doing this Zoom. It's a way for me to share the information that I have. It's a bit wordy just because it gives you something to look at and to read as I speak. But hopefully it's also going to be something that's useful for you, and with us recording this, something you can reflect on later if you need to. Who am I? As Pascal mentioned, I am a registered clinical counselor with Ocean Counseling, which is my private practice, and have just completed in January this year 14 years at Richmond Addictions as a addiction prevention specialist. So lots of experience over the last 20 years working with youth and families, and having the opportunity to engage people in their experience of life, and having been in the prevention field for so long, a lot of my work in addiction prevention was having an understanding of who people are and how we are. And I think that lends me an opportunity to kind of speak to our experience as people and as carers. And my hope is that as you come into this Zoom session, that you're able to hold in suspension kind of what you hope to gain from this. There's something that's motivated you to show up tonight and to be here. And my hope is that this is going to be, useful for you. And like I said, that if you have questions, by all means, feel free to jot those and we can talk about those. Now, as a starting point, just jumping into things, I think it's fair to look at this experience through the perspective of COVID. The reason that I'm meeting with you through Zoom is because of COVID and the coronavirus, and that this is this giant kind of ongoing consideration of our lived experience as people. And I think as I was reflecting on what I would like to share tonight, that this was something that really came to my mind is not to take light of what COVID has brought into our experience as people, as parents, as caregivers. New York Times recently published this humorous article, and not to make light of the difficulty that COVID's brought into people's lives, the loss that we've encountered, but the humor of this article, symptoms of the new variant, whatever that new variant is, we're just kind of coming through one variant and seeing some changes with respect to COVID. But it is to say that this has been something that has long been something that we've been dealing with and having to negotiate and think about, and that the constant change has been something that provokes a response and makes us feel something. I found this post not so long ago, and I really found it it spoke some truth. The weirdest part of living through the COVID pandemic is this strange mixture of normalcy and emergency that we're all experiencing. I constantly feel like I'm either over or underreacting, or both at the same time. It's surreal. And I think all of us can relate to that there's times in the pandemic where we felt like we're really going almost too much into our protective kind of posture. And there's times where it feels like maybe we're being too cavalier or casual about it. And we're always kind of balancing this kind of feeling to it. And how am I actually reacting to the ongoing impact of the pandemic in life? And what this leads to is stress, and that we're all living with this activated stress response because of the pandemic. And I think that's why I really felt it was important to mention this is we're here to learn about supporting teenagers and supporting ourselves in our parenting or our caregiving. And we can't underestimate the significance of the context of our experience in life right now, that the pandemic and COVID has brought into our experience this chronic little kind of hum of stress in the background of how are we reacting, how are we dealing with it? Should I be wearing my mask or shouldn't I? Did I remember to sanitize my hands or didn't I? Am I standing too close to this person or not? Was I, should I have gone to that place or shouldn't I have? And you can imagine this kind of feeling. And I think we've all had this at times of laying in bed and just kind of being preoccupied with all the additional layers of pressure and stress from COVID. And then you add that to just the life stressors of who we are as people and how we're dealing with these things as people. And you can imagine that for a lot of us, the rope is quite frayed, and we're living with a lot of tension and pressure. And part of me sharing this is because this is an experience that as both parents and teens alike, that as parents we're stretched thin and we're having to deal with all the ongoing changes of the pandemic. And for our teenagers, we know that they have been experiencing significant impact in their experience because of the pandemic, and how school, the format of school, the classroom process and procedure, mask wearing, the impacts on learning, the capacity of their teachers, the change in terms of class size, having to consolidate classes into tight kind of shorter time periods. Like there's significant effects on our teenagers that COVID's brought into their world, which means we really want to have a compassionate understanding, not just from a developmental perspective, what is unique about being a teenager, and I'll talk about that, but just in the context of our culture, what's going on and how teens, let alone we ourselves as parents, are dealing with things. And with that in mind, thinking of all of us as people having this ongoing stress experience, I think it was it's meaningful for me to share this metaphor of a window of tolerance. And this is created by Dan Siegel, who's a psychologist, and it's a useful perspective that we can bring into our experience when it comes to the experience of life that we encounter every day. So a window of tolerance is really just the ideal experience of arousal in which a person is able to most effectively function and deal with life. So it speaks to what am I capable of managing and dealing with. And if you think of a window, you picture a window opening or closing, is sometimes the window is wide open and there's a nice breeze and everything's comfortable. And sometimes the window is really tight and nothing's getting in or out. And we can picture this window of tolerance from this icon here, that the green is the window, the arrows open and close depending on circumstance of life. And sometimes we respond to the life circumstances through hyperarousal, and sometimes it's through hypoarousal. Hyperarousal is more like you get hyperactive, is like you're activated. So hyperarousal is kind of the fight flight response. So you're triggered, your mind gets racy, it's angry, you've got anxiousness, you feel like your feelings are out of control. That's the hyperarousal. On the flip side, the hypoarousal is the freeze response. Your mind gets foggy, you become emotionally numb, maybe you dissociate, you kind of shut down. And the sweet spot in the middle is that window of tolerance where you feel centered, you feel in touch with yourself, you're able to weather the ups and downs of your day. And looking at the symptoms, hyperarousal, like I said, high energy, anxious, anger outbursts, overwhelmed, chaotic, hypervigilance. Hypoarousal, you shut down, you're numb, depression, withdrawn, shame, or passive. And then that sweet spot, grounded, flexible, open, curious, present, able to emotionally self-regulate. It's a good place to be. And I think that this is a useful tool to use because it speaks to our experience as things are happening. And going back to what I mentioned on the idea of the pandemic, is it gives some, I guess, material or some language to speak to what's going on when we react to things. And this can be really helpful when we're understanding ourselves, let alone our young ones that we're caring for, is because of the stressors of life and the impacts on life as a whole for a teenager, we could imagine that their window of tolerance is narrower than normal. So things that when they're in their best place, they're capable of tolerating and managing relatively well. In the current dynamic of life, they may not be managing it as well as in the past, or as well as they could. And what I've always really liked about the window of tolerance is that it's not a judgment statement. It's not a bad thing to have a narrow window, no more than it's a sign of excellence that you have an open window. All we need to know is that it's open or it's closed, or it's wider or it's narrower. And it just gives us information and understanding to say, how can I recognize what's the best response for me so that I can, play and relate well with myself and other people. So I offer that as just something to think about, when you're talking to your partner maybe, or to your kid, is, how are you tolerating the things of life? And what helps open your window? Because everybody's got their style of taking care of themselves. Maybe it's going for walks in nature. Maybe it's time with a pet. Maybe it's time with a good friend. Maybe it's a good meal. Maybe it's a good book. Maybe you need to go to the movies and just escape for 2 hours. All these different types of things that you might personally have are ways that we can kind of open that tolerance window and feel like I'm capable of managing the stress that life's bringing. So just reflect, I guess, just briefly for yourself, how has the pandemic affected you? How are you tolerating just the stressors of life? And what might you personally need, let alone the people that you care for need, to kind of open the window a little bit and just feel a little bit more fresh air kind of moving in and out, allowing us to deal with things as they come and go. Now, shifting gears, I'm here because of teenagers. That's what you've asked me to talk about, is teenagers and adolescence. And I love this because I think it's such a beautiful stage of life. It's interesting. Sometimes when I was in high school speaking, I'd ask the question, what's the purpose of being a teen? And most teenagers would have no real specific answer outside of maybe something along the lines of just growing up. And that kind of is the best way to describe it. But it's helpful to think about the purpose of the teen years, that this is a really pivotal time in our lives. And all of us have experienced this because we were teens at one time too. So you think about the tasks of teenage life as we're growing up physically, to achieve physical maturity. By the time we're 19, 20 years old, hopefully our bodies have fully reached their physical maturity. So just growing into our bodies, and that happens at different stages, different pace for different people. Some 13-year-olds are already 7 feet tall, and some won't reach their full height until they have that last growth spurt at 19 years old. But growing into our body physically is part of being a teenager. Exploring sexuality, we know that sexuality is like implicitly a part of puberty. So understanding who we are as a sexual being, what it means to have a sexual awareness, how that's practiced or understood, and how that fits with the sense of identity is a big part of being a teenager. And the hope would be that by the time you're 19, you're gaining a greater grasp of what it means to have a sexual component to life. And we see that possibly for a teenager in their intimate relationships. As teens start to get older, they start to establish more intimate relationships. And that doesn't just have to be like dating or sexual relationships. That's just in terms of friendships. As friendships get more nuanced and deeper, and there's more maturity in terms of how we relate to people and who we choose to share our lives with. That's part of growing up, is what does it mean to have a close relationship? It's very different at 18 versus 13, and that's part of growth and maturity. Social maturity, as we grow up, the more we relate to people, we think of schools as places to learn, but they're also social little fishbowls. So we throw all these teenagers into a building and we say socialize, coexist, figure it out. And that's not always an easy, smooth process, but the hope is by the time a young person reaches their adult life, that social maturity is being accomplished. Their communication is growing, and their capacity to relate to one another is more mature. Intellectual maturity, that's why they're in school. Train the brain, learn to memorize and problem solve, and find the topics and the issues in the world that you are interested in intellectually, right? We want that to be happening as a young person gets older. Independence, the hope is at some point the little birds will fly the nest, and they will have that independence, whether it's their own sense of family at some point, financial independence, education, and how that leads to vocation and career. As teens get older, there's more independence, and we see those markers of independence as they get older, from 13 to 16 and driving a car, and 18 graduating high school. Is like these little hinge points of greater independence. And then establishing a set of values and practice applying them. As parents, caregivers, one of the main things we're doing is layering into the lives of our little ones, our young ones, the values that we hold important. And our hope is that those might translate and that our kids might grab those for themselves. But we're also hoping to create opportunities for kids to find the values that are important to them and practice applying them, putting them into the essence of who they are and how they live their lives. So being a teenager isn't just an age that just is passed by. It's a really vital, important part of life. And I think that shifts us to a conversation on the brain, that we want to be talking about the teen brain and how that develops, and what's unique about the teen brain. You can think of it this way, right? Whenever I think of brains, it's the zombie image of brains, and that there's this mystery to the teenage brain because it's so complex and there's so much to understand about what's happening in the developing teen brain. The adolescent phase of brain growth is crucial because this is when parts of the brain are developing that are responsible for logical thinking, reasoning, judgment, planning, execution, and other mental processes. So really important functions of the brain are happening in the adolescent stage. And then there's considerations we want to have around why teens behave the way that they do, around what the brain is doing in its developmental momentum. We think of hormones, like the hormonal changes that are happening in puberty are profound. And just implicitly from that hormonal perspective, that's going to have a factor into how a teen thinks and behaves and feels. the prefrontal lobe is developing, and that prefrontal lobe is the part of the brain that's responsible for making rational choices. It's the part that's involved with assessing risk associated with actions we take, judgments that we have, impulse control, behavior inhibition. This is all developing, and it's structurally developing, but it's not necessarily functional fully for a teenager. So it doesn't transmit information as quickly as it does in an adult brain. And that's just because neurons aren't processing, the transmission isn't going as fast, and the impulsivity is much more for a teenager. So teens are always more likely to feel more and think less just by a developmental perspective. And they're much more emotionally vulnerable because of the mood swings that they experience. They're more prone to making impulsive decisions based on their emotions over logic. And that's just an impulsive kind of component of the brain developing. The synaptic pruning, what that just speaks to is that the connections in the brain between neurons and the way the brain communicates, and actually the quantity of those connections changes as a teen, and they actually reduce. And that's because the brain is becoming more systematized. It's organizing itself and the thought process by transmitting information as easily as possible. And that's going to affect how a teen brain works. And then the amygdala and limbic system, these are just responsible for emotions, right? This part of the brain develops before the prefrontal cortex, which is reason and thinking, right? The prefrontal cortex identifies the emotions, names them and labels them. This might be why we think it's difficult to handle or identify emotions in the situation, because the amygdala limbic system is the feeling part that's activated. Now, this is also the pleasure reward zone of the brain, and it's fully developed while the risk assessment part of the brain is developing. So risk assessment's still in process while the pleasure reward system is fully developed. And that's why you tend to see a teenager access like the psychological rewards. It makes me feel good through a risky behavior. And they're not thinking about the consequences because the front of the brain hasn't quite developed yet. So you could look at these two kind of regions of the brain as the key things to consider for a teenager. The amygdala, responsible for emotions, anger, happiness, sadness, rapidly develops, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for thinking, reasoning, logic, is not fully developed and slowly over time is developing. So it makes sense for why teens are significantly emotional creatures and not always as logical as we'd like them to be. And this brain development momentum happens until your early 20s. So understanding that this isn't just a teenage consideration, but delayed adolescence, moving on into like early 20s, is that the brain is continuing to develop and figure itself out as we continue to age. And all of that developmental conversation is important because we turn the picture back to ourselves as carers. And what does this demand of us? Well, it demands great patience. That we have to understand that developmental process that a teenager is going through and have the patience in the process as they go through the feelings, as their capacity for reason and judgment continues to develop. Patience when we ask the questions of why and we don't get good answers to the why, knowing that maybe they don't even know why they did what they did. It was just emotion that was driving them in those moments. So knowing that as a teen brain develops, let's try to have as much patience in the process as we can, while still working with our kids to make the best decisions and be their best selves. There's something to say in the developmental understanding that there's a social component to how we view youth right now in our society, that society still chooses to look at teenagers as children instead of embracing the transition to adulthood. And we really wrestle with this, that our youth are showing us who they are and what they need all the time. And it's really important that we learn to just honor their emerging values and listen to their struggles and support their dreams as these things begin to express. We hold teenagers back when we question their motives and identity. And instead, we need to guide them along this natural progression into young adulthood. And parenting can feel very powerless at times. But we have the opportunity to engage young people's lives in significant ways. We can change their lives in significant ways by just coming alongside them and being curious. seeing the world from their perspective, because how a teenager sees things matters greatly. So trying not to see teenagers as just little kids, but seeing them for the mature, developing, unique individuals they are, and coming alongside in a curious way to say, who are you? And I want to get to know who you are as you go through that process yourself. And this, when I was preparing this brought to my mind this idea of location, that in this developmental kind of momentum of the brain kind of forming and a young person growing, how do we locate them or help them locate themselves in the process and experience? Because this is more of an accurate picture of what's going on inside the life and mental process of a teenager. It's chaos, it's feelings, it's people, it's emotions, it's desire, it's frustrations, it's so many different things, and it's all, you're all over the place. And our responsibility, and I think our opportunity as people who care and as parents who care, is to try to help locate our kids in this experience. And I think the best answer to how that location occurs is through relationship, is we want to meet them in our proximity to them, meet our kids in our relationship with them. And this idea of relationship invites an attachment perspective to how we relate to our kids and the young people we work with. Now, attachment is a popular word and a common word that we get talked about, and it's a really important word. And it's about safety, it's about expression, and it's about relationship fundamentally. Now, the purpose of attachment, how a child attaches with their parent, is that we want to ensure a child depends on the responsible adult to take care of them. So that's from the perspective of the child, that the child, the teenager, should have a sense of trust that their adult is going to take care of them and their needs. And you could look at that literally just through like the basics of, food, shelter, clothing, but then moving into the more emotional, deeper needs of what do they actually need to accomplish this thing called life, that they trust that their adult is there to take care of them. Another purpose of attachment, ensure that an adult takes responsibility for taking care of the child. So if the child is going to trust us, we as adults need to take on the responsibility to say, my job is to take care of you, my child, my young one. That's my purpose. That's my responsibility, and I'll do everything I can. And that's kind of leading the way, right? I'm out front. I know what's best for you. I know what you need, and I'm going to be with you in this journey, and you can trust me in it. And in the chaos that a kid's feeling, they look to you and they can feel comfort knowing that their parent has them. That when they go through a stressful day, they can come home to the consistency or the predictability that home is going to be a safe place, that mom or dad are going to see me for who I am, not all the questions that I'm holding inside my head of who might I be, right? So taking on the responsibility is an important part of attachment. And then another purpose is to form connections that gives us the foundation for a child to grow from. So if you think of literally like a growth metaphor, that children are these little trees growing up into big, beautiful, mature trees. How do we provide the foundation for children to grow from, so that they've got secure roots and they've got grounding? They know who they are, and they're gonna weather the storms that life brings. So the connection that we have through our relationship with our young ones gives that foundation for good expression and good growth. And that's another significant purpose of attachment, which is that relational component becomes a container where vulnerable emotions can be expressed. So because teenagers are implicitly, as I mentioned, deeply emotional creatures because of the way the brain works, is we want to create the container, the safe place where emotions can be explored and expressed and understood. That the shame that might come with feeling sad or feeling weak or feeling insecure can be held and expressed and processed with somebody who cares for them and that they trust. So significant purposes in attachment to create a condition for becoming, a healthy individual, a well-rounded kind of well-adjusted young person can happen through that attachment proximity. And for a child, good attachment looks like this. They will listen, they'll follow you, they'll seek out your help when it's needed. They trust the adult in their life. They like their company. They want to measure up to an expectation. They look for guidance. They want to be taken care of. That's what we're hoping to see. And I understand, and I'll talk about this, that this can shift in what this looks like for teenagers, but this is the ideal, is that these things are underneath the surface of how the child relates to their adult. For the adult, good attachment is we take care of our children. We orient them and we inform them, we equip them, we protect, we defend, we guide, we direct, we look out for them, we lead, we share our values, we're generous, we're warm. We're creating that relational container to be safe, to be seen, to be experienced, to be held. So attachment is a significant consideration around the relational context that we have with our young ones. And this invites the question for you at this point in my presentation of just like, what is your relationship with your child like right now? Can you do a brief attachment assessment? Are you connected? Is there a lot of distance? Is there need for some proximity? How often do you spend time together? What does that look like? And I know that comes with questions because teenagers are naturally resistant to our efforts to reach out, but continuing to have an attachment perspective is important, and trying to find ways to maintain those attachments as best as we can is never effort wasted. I think it's always good effort. And then that brings up what happens for the teenager, which I think is the challenge you'd have to what I'm saying around attachment, is when our teenagers start to grow up, all of a sudden something happens where the next thing we know, they're breaking up with us. There's a time for many of us where our children are like our little besties. You know, they've got a great relationship with us, or we have an actual connection with them. But there's something that happens in the mature process of adolescence where kids will break up with their parents. And what this breaks down to, or is understood as, is this idea of individuation, which is a really important part of adolescence. It's the process of coming to know and give expression to and harmonize the many components of oneself. So as youth fashion their identity, right, as they become their own person, at times it can look like they're rejecting everything, especially our relationship with them. And it's really challenging, but it's important to not see this as a personal rejection, but as an important stage of development. That individuation is actually what we want, because we don't want them to just depend on us for the rest of time. We want them to become young individuals who have a sense of self and agency to go live life. But it can be really difficult emotionally when that breakup feeling happens and it feels like something has shifted and the rejection is experienced, and that feels deeply personal. But to try to take a step back, take a deep breath and say, this may not be as much as it seems like a personal rejection, so much as a part of their process of development. And that requires a lot of self-care to kind of process what we're feeling in those moments, because this can be an entry point to a lot of triggers. I'm a strong believer that we're kind of products of our own container. So as much as I'm saying the attachment perspective you have to your children matters, it's also reflecting backwards to say, what was it like for you growing up with your parents, right? What attachment wounds might you be carrying from how you related with your parents? Different generations had different approaches to parenting and to relationships between child and parent. And you may be carrying some baggage, so to speak, that deserves some attention to say, when my kid goes through this process of individuation and I feel like they're rejecting me, it's provoking deeply personal responses that actually don't have as much to do with my child as they have something to do with me and what I'm feeling. And that takes some really intentional work to say, what's this about and how do I understand this? So anticipate that this will happen. There's going to be that individuation. And like many breakups, sometimes the breakups aren't as harsh as others. Some breakups can be really brutal, but some breakups can actually be quite amicable, and they don't have to be devastating. So in the process of individuation, it's allowing this to happen and knowing that in the breaking up, it's not as devastating as it needs to be if we continue to understand the process that's happening. So hopefully you're still with me. I can't see anybody. It's literally me just looking at my computer, which feels kind of weird, but I know now you're like, okay, Danny, you're giving us lots of information, but we still want to know how. How do we do this? How do we parent? How do we deal with our teenagers? And I'm with you. The how question matters lots. So for the next little while, I'll give you some really practical things to think about and to relate to. In preparing, I found this, which I liked. Welcome to being a parent of a teenager. Prepare for a large amount of eye-rolling emotional outbursts and thoughts of running away. And that's just the parents. Parenting is not for the sleight of heart and is a courageous endeavor for all of us. But there are practical things that we can think about with respect to how we can do this. And I think the first thing that would come to my mind that matters is communication. And communication is how we relate to the people around us. That's how we interact with other human beings, is we connect and we communicate. And communication isn't rocket science, right? A quick Google search and you'll find like 5 tips for effective communication. Communicate relentlessly, simplify and be direct, listen and encourage input, illustrate through stories, affirm with actions. Like, wow, those are 5 really easy, actionable steps that I could take to communicate. But it's not that simple, because how am I supposed to talk with my youth? They're a teenager and they're complicated, or they don't want to talk to me, and all these different kind of things that come up with teenagers. So some things to think about with respect to how we talk to our youth. Youth will ask for advice when they feel understood. So anticipate that. Once a teenager feels like they're being understood, they're far more likely to come looking for advice or information or support. Many youth want to know how we will respond before they come to us for support, right? And we communicate this through our daily interactions. What's the predictability of how mom or dad are going to respond to me if I ask for some support, or if I ask for some understanding, or I have a question or a favor, or whatever it's going to be? I have to disclose something. Like, what is the reaction I'm going to get? They want to know what that response is going to be, and that it's going to be something that understands where they're coming from and gives them an openness. And there's deep, significant power in offering your youth a listening ear and an open mind. Is just being available, asking questions, being curious, and not being quick to jump to conclusions. And then in the way that we talk is that we're trying to help our teens take ownership over solutions. That it's not just spoon feeding the answers, but it's really nurturing this agency that comes through as they get older, so that as they face difficulties or crossroads in life, they're capable of taking steps to make decisions for themselves, right? When teens arrive at their own solutions, they feel like they're in control. They don't need to rebel. They don't need to run away, because they feel like they've got some agency. And when we talk down to them, they reject our ideas. Nobody likes to be controlled. And it's not going to help us get across a message. So we need to trust that our teens want to do the right thing, that like there is a goodness implicit in who they are. They want to be good for us. And a key is to honor their intelligence in that and help them figure out how to make right choices on their own. So from a parental perspective, 3 ideas that came to my mind of how we can talk to our youth. The first idea would just be to validate. Really start with validation. Our purpose is not to raise happy kids or mini-me's or fix their behavior. Our purpose, our invitation is to walk beside youth with compassionate curiosity for who they truly are. As that gets expressed, as that gets discovered, that's one of the most beautiful things about having a child, is they're not you. They're a unique individual, and they've got components of you, but we get to have that curiosity to say, let's discover who this young person is and get to know who they are in that curious way alongside them. Providing validation supports your young ones being and becoming. If that's kind of the purpose of being a teenager, is to grow into themselves and to find a sense of self, our validation supports that process, that who they are matters in the moment, in the ongoing process of brain development and personal exploration and discovery and self-definition. Validation supports youth in their experience rather than exhausting energy, trying to convince you of their experience. When validated, energy can instead be channeled towards self-regulation. So instead of getting into these back and forths, these arguments of who's right, who's wrong, whose perspective is better than whose, we don't need to get into them trying to express and communicate their experience to us and justify it, but we can validate them in their experience, even if we don't agree with it. It's their experience. And then we can help that energy that they'd use trying to defend themselves move towards their self-regulation. They've got lots of feelings happening, like we said. This is an implicit part of the way the brain works. So if we can help stoke that self-regulating kind of component and capacity, then like that's going to be greatly beneficial, not just to ourselves as parents, but to the kid themselves. So validation is significant. It makes space for youth to find their feels, right? Feel them, know that those feelings are real, they're human, and find their way through life with supportive presence. So validation is just allowing teens to feel like they can rest in being seen and heard. It supports connection and eventually problem solving when needed, right? When you've got that connection, then we can move to like, let's solve or deal with the problems. And then a sense of togetherness gets established. There's teamwork in terms of responding to things because it feels like you're with me. You're not just telling me what to do or telling me what I'm doing wrong. If you had a friend telling you that their day was bad and you denied it, I don't think that would go very well. Culture can sometimes find it difficult to validate teenagers. We don't often say like what you think or how you feel matters. We kind of look down. So there can be a conditioned perspective to say like teenagers are just naive and social media obsessed and distracted and et cetera, but instead to validate them and say the difficulties, the conflicts, the stresses that a teenager goes through are as human as ours as adults. And we really want to just meet them where they're at. And that what teens want is to know that they've got somebody on their side and literally somebody who's walking alongside with them. In a lot of the youth programs that I've done over history, and any youth workers who are listening today will know that sitting in a room doing a group where you're at a table across from each other can be effective. But some of the most like significant conversations I've ever had with a teenager was side by side driving in a car, where there's no like face-to-face kind of posture. It's just like, I'm with you in the car, we're going somewhere. And there's just a casualness to that invites an honesty and a realness in the conversation that can be really meaningful. So how to talk to your youth, validate their experience. There's a gift in that you've been through the experience of being a teenager, so you can validate it as being human. But don't underestimate the significance of that. Another thing you can do is listen. If you want your youth to listen, you need to listen to your youth. I think there's a reciprocity to that. Like if I'm demanding that you listen to me, I should probably be taking the time to think through, am I giving attention to listen to what my youth is saying to me? If you want your youth to talk to you in the future, you need to listen to them in the present. What are they saying today? And keep in mind, the listening isn't just verbal auditory listening. I hear the words coming out of your mouth. This is just listening to their behaviors, their patterns, their friendships, their style, the clothes they wear, the way they do their hair, the music they listen to. Is just, we kind of listen to it. We keep our radar up, we pay attention, and we stay curious to it. Listening is the path to connection. This is a way that somebody feels understood, where somebody feels like someone's hearing them. And listening supports us to uncover what's actually going on. Like, what's the deeper concern for a child in the given moment? Oftentimes we just see the presenting behavior, the presenting emotion, and we forget to ask the deeper questions. Like, what could be behind this? What could actually be going on that might be provoking what's here? The thought comes to my mind, and I've used this example in the past, like video games. I like to think of video games as correlated to a spiritual vacuum in our younger generations. Because if you think about video games, most of the games that young people play are purposeful. You become a character, right? You like become an avatar, and you like have like special qualities and capabilities, and like you get to self-define through this character. And then there's like a task to accomplish. I must go and do something. There's something powerful to that. That's like, I have a purpose in this game that I must do. And then they turn the game off and they're like, I'm bored. What am I supposed to do? And some of that is like a spiritual thing of like, what's the purpose that our young people are being called to? My wife reminded me of a story I read recently about a guy in the States, and his 16-year-old daughter was going through a lot of emotional stuff, where they were seeing it in her clothing she was wearing, the makeup she wore, her behavior and attitude was just kind of deteriorating, and they're really worried for her, wondering if it's depression, and she was just kind of oppositional. And they realized that they needed to do something. So they ended up adopting some organization in some developing nation, and they started to go to this nation to do like humanitarian work. And they invited their kids into that process with them. So they brought their daughter and they went to this country and they did this work. And then over the course of a year, they kept engaging in this effort. They kept, it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was like an ongoing thing. Like, our family's doing this, and we're going to continue to do it. And they slowly started to see things shift with their daughter. And what they realized was what their daughter really wanted was a bigger story than what she was living. She needed a bigger purpose. And I think that sometimes that can be a perspective that we can take in our listening, is we pay attention to what they're going through, and we try to just say, what might be going on? Maybe my kid just needs a greater sense of opportunity, and we can invite them to that. We can encourage them to that, right? I don't think it's a surprise that teenagers, particularly kids in this generation, are one of the most protected generations ever. When I was a kid, and I'm old now, but like not so long ago, you know, like we'd literally like cut through a cemetery because it was the fastest way to get to the corner store to buy candy. And nowadays I can't even think of parents being like, yeah, just cut through the cemetery to go to the corner store by yourself at 9-10 years old. Things have changed. So like, how do we listen to what our youth need, listen to what they're wanting, and respond as much as we can to what's happening in those moments? So validate, listen, and then be present. Fixing our youth's problems does not fix their feelings, but presence with your own feelings is the best way to being present with theirs. So it's deeply a personal endeavor. How do I attend to myself and what I feel and how I'm going to respond so that I can be present with what my kid's feeling? If I'm reacting to my child's anger or outbursts or procrastination or defiance, what's it provoking in me? How am I feeling in those moments? And how can I attend to those feelings so that I can be present in my feels and then be present to what my kid is feeling? That's an important process, and it's not an easy process. I don't want that to seem simple. Being a good parent isn't about saying the right words, but rather more about being your authentic self in proximity to a young one. So what is your authentic self, right? That's a personal question and a personal journey. And if I can find that grounding for myself, then that can allow me to be more present authentically with my kid. Kids are intuitive, right? They're deeply aware of what is happening and what their parents are saying or wanting. They can read in between the lines, and they want authenticity. So how can we be authentically with them and what they're experiencing? And that's the fundamental starting point before any words are going to come. When we sit in our connected wholeness, a holistic acceptance of self, this is me, my weaknesses, my strengths, my experiences, my hopes, my fears, this is me. When we sit in that with honesty, our youth can sense it and find it possible to rest in the present moment. They trust us because they know that we get it. And then they can rest in our presence, and then they can find rest in themselves. It doesn't feel as confusing. It doesn't feel as alarming to try to figure everything out. Their sense of self is no longer an issue of behaving certain ways to achieve approval. You have to be this way. It becomes something about self-exploration, self-discovery, self-determination. Their emerging self is safe in the presence of a secure adult support. And if any of us go back to our story, we know that there's ebbs and flows in that self-discovery, that we all go through stages of various clothing styles and music and expression and experimentation. But when we're well held, when we're seen for who we are in the big picture, that can be a significant holder to contain us as we kind of go through those changes to self-discovery. So how do you talk to your youth? Validate them, try to listen to them, and be present with them. And then because with our teenagers, we're going to get the no, we're going to get the resistance, we're going to get that defiance. So when we hear the no, recognize that a no is totally developmentally appropriate. And it's actually a really important part of growing into a unique individual sense of self, is to be able to say no. Because that's a statement of boundary, that's a statement of capacity, that's a statement of self, right? This is what I want or don't want. So try not to see no's as just implicitly disrespectful. Young people have every right to disagree and challenge the status quo. They're pushing back at what doesn't feel right or what doesn't feel authentic or valuable to them in the moment. Now, the manner they express their no might invite some refining, because they can be lippy teenagers, but the no itself is really powerful. When we hear the no's, it's evidence that a teen is actively in the process of cultivating a sense of identity, separate from family, separate from parents, like this is me. And it's a step towards that independence, that young adulthood that we're looking for. Because on the flip side, we're going to get the yeses as well, right? And when we hear a no, it's an invitation to go deeper. What's the no about? What's actually being held of value to the kid in those moments? These are moments of connection if we're wanting to go into it. They're requesting us to see them as whole, worthy, complete, equal, join forces with them, collaborate, have a dialogue. It's not an invitation just for the relationship to break down, for opposition. Try to be curious of the no. And this is a different perspective than most of us grew up with, right? Most of us, the no wasn't appropriate, but saying no supports teens. When they say no to us, it supports them to say no to other people, other risky behaviors. Like, we want them to have their no voice. So we want to empower them to listen to the inner voice with wisdom, guidance, learn to express it in a safe, responsible, respectful way. But don't be threatened by the no. It's not easy. Again, I know this sounds simple. It's complicated, but listen to what's behind the no when we hear it, because there's something about the self being expressed. You think of this example, you don't understand. And if I respond to that with, yeah, I do, I was a teenager once, then that could be experienced as just dismissive. You're not really listening to me. But if my response is, you're right, I don't understand, but I'm willing to share more, if you're willing to share more, like I'm listening, that becomes about validation. That becomes about curious listening, about presence. It can be such a gift for a young person. So really try to take the one down approach. I think it's about having confidence in our capacity as caregivers, that we're not going to be threatened in taking that kind of approach, because we see the big picture. We're not going to lose power when we say, like, I don't understand. I don't have to prove myself with the kid, but I get to listen to them and be curious about what they're saying, because I trust I already know who I am and I know what's best for my kid. So say what you need to say, and I got you through all of it. A couple things on understanding your teen. The more you try to control them, the more they're going to show you that you can't. So don't try controlling. It's probably going to be a lot of wasted effort. You can't control other people. It's counterintuitive to the developmental process that teenagers implicitly are on. So try to remove yourself from a posture of control. Release your expectations for who youth should be, like who you think they should be. And by releasing those expectations, it creates space for a teenager to show us who they truly are, which is such a gift. So recognize where those expectations come from, and learning to hold them openly. It doesn't mean we have to reject their expectations, but just the tightness of a hold, release it, just open-handed. I'd like this, but I'm not going to expect it because you're a unique individual. Show me who you are and let me get to know you. And that relationship has power. Disappointment is a lack of curiosity, compassion. It speaks to expectation and measurement, and kids don't respond well to that. So if you're feeling disappointed, I'd suggest stoke some curiosity. What's going on for my kid? Nurture your compassion for them, the complexity of being a teenager in today's world. The more curious you become, the more your teenager is going to be willing to invite you into their world. But check your motivation, because if your motivation is just to get into their world, teens will sense that as inauthentic. They want sincerity. Let your heart guide you, that you're real and you just care. And that's going to matter more to a teenager than you're thinking your way through it. Teenagers have a right to complain. It's part of being human. So I know they might complain a lot, and sometimes that's annoying, but it's part of being human. So just giving them space to vent their feelings. And like we said earlier, they're deeply emotional creatures. So we're going to get a lot of this at this stage of the game. Adolescence is hard enough when everything's going smooth. There's nothing more important than aligning with, attuning to, and listening to a teen through tough times. What they need isn't a solution, but somebody by their side. So shifting away from solution perspective to just being with our young people in their process of self-discovery matters. And when we hear the complaints, don't tune out, try to tune in. It's a deeply meaningful opportunity to connect. Teens are calling us into their worlds when they complain, right? Be curious, be open. It's a call to listen. Tell me more about why you're annoyed by that. Tell me more about why math sucks. Why is that teacher the worst teacher ever, right? Just keep asking the questions and allow their voice to express itself and explore itself with you. Deb McNamara is a wonderful human being and a good friend of mine, and she has some wonderful resources on her website and has is a great gift to understanding parenting from an attachment perspective. And she has a thing on her site on 5 things teens need from parents. So I borrowed this from her that I think is useful, just again to kind of reiterate some of the things I've been sharing tonight. But teens need from us an invitation and an affirmation of who they are becoming. Take a genuine interest in their thoughts, opinions, and feelings. Listen without judgment. Include comments, help me understand. Invite them as they explore and they start to separate, a sense of self. It's what you draw out of your youth that matters most for healthy individuation. So just be a nurturer of self-expression and discovery, and affirm what you're seeing. Validate, validate, validate. Create room for self-reflection. Self-reflection is a key to identity development. Create spaces for youth to express themselves without pressure to perform, right? Give them emotional playgrounds, music, movement, art, drama, singing, nature, different experiences. We're going to take the Canada Line to Granville Island and wander around, get ice cream, and take the Canada Line back, right? Just emotional playgrounds to just express who they are through movement and action is really helpful for them to reflect on what's going on. Self-reflection doesn't have to be a conscious thing. Remember, their rational thinking self is still in development. So self-reflection can be a deeply intuitive thing, a very creative thing. It's some of the irony of social media that can be social media can have its downsides, absolutely, but it can also be a wonderful tool of self-expression. So trying to understand what might this invite for self-expression in an emotional way that can be safe, and what are some of the risks when it's just peers relating with peers. Normalize sadness. If we've watched the movie Inside Out, we know that sadness is important. Transition brings sadness. Change brings loss as much as it brings newness. The teen years are a roller coaster of emotion, and making room for sadness, normalizing sadness, lets teens express their emotions. Validate the emotions you see and observe. Try to prioritize their feelings over their behaviors. If there's one thing I say to parents, whenever I get a parent client in my private practice and they start talking about the behaviors of their kid, the first encouragement is, let's go to the feelings. What's your kid feeling? What's going on for them in these moments? Not just what's the behavior that we need to change, but what's the feeling that's being experienced, that's being acknowledged. Let a child experience disillusionment naturally. Trial and error, mistakes is part of life. Teens want autonomy to make mistakes and to try things out on their own. We need to provide guardrails to help them stay safe while also encouraging them to take the wheel of their life. So creating these opportunities where there's some trust and some risk that's a part of the process. And then teens need our patience and care. As I said earlier, development takes time, so be patient. For our young people's self-absorbed ways, intense emotions, and frequent idealism, like that's a teenager. And then continue to focus on connection. Be curious, try to laugh at things, trust that there's a plan implicitly, naturally in kids to grow and develop into individuals. And that in some ways we're along for the ride. There's days where that will feel like a burden, but there's also days where that is a gift. We get to witness this incredible becoming. Now I'm almost done. I'm sure you're ready to hear me stop talking, and there's lots of questions, I'm sure. But to succinctly put everything into really practical, because again, with parents and anybody that I've worked with, even at this point, they're like, Danny, just give me the steps. What do I need to do? So here's 10 strategies to support your kids in bite-sized pieces. Be curious, right? A friendly way. Just be curious about your kid, what they're feeling, who they're with, what they like, what they don't like, what they eat, what they don't eat, what they do with their time. Just be curious. Why do you like that video game? How do you play it? What's the purpose? Just be curious. Lots of curiosity. Stoke that. Be open, right? You may have your expectations. You may have limits and family rules and consequences, but try to be open to that process and conversation with kids. Try to avoid having ultimatums. Be really specific about rules and guidelines. Be short and to the point. Be concise. Be flexible. Some of our rules sometimes don't matter. Be open. I remember when I was 16 and I had my dad's car, and I had a curfew of, I think, 10 p.m. And I felt like I didn't need a curfew anymore because my friends didn't have one. So I went to my parents and said, I think I'm mature enough and old enough. I don't need a curfew. And they sat there for a moment, and then they said, okay, you don't have a curfew anymore. And I was like, that's it? It was that easy? And then they said, but the car has a curfew of 11 p.m. So if you bring the car back, you can go back out as long as you want. And they found a loophole. But their openness was appreciated, that it wasn't just an immediate shutdown or immediate reaction to me. There was a bit of openness to it, and I appreciated that. So be open. Start early. If you got 13-year-olds, get at this now. If you've got 8-year-olds, start talking about things. Have conversations now. And it's not too late if they're 18 or older. Just start early. The earlier you are to invite perspective, the better. Invite their opinions, and I guarantee you their opinions will annoy you. That's kind of part of their process, is to try to provoke, but just invite their perspectives. Allow them to explore having unique perspectives. Let them know their choices, boundaries, limits, what's safe, let them know that they have choice and options in this, because that can be helpful. It helps them with that sense of, I have freedom to make decisions, right? There's some choice here. And then prioritize safety. The reason we have guidelines and rules is safety. And I think that answers the proverbial, why is this the question? My parents, why do I have to bring the car home at 11 p.m.? Well, it was about safety. We just think you driving late at night with your friends is more risky. So for safety reasons, we'd like the car home. So safety can be the priority, your fallback. Set an example, right? Use guidelines, be responsible in terms of your own behaviors. Have things in mind of what's appropriate, what's not. Anticipate mistakes. Any of you who are adults in this chat, you've made mistakes yourself and you've learned from them. That's the purpose of mistakes. Let's reflect and learn. So don't anticipate a mistake-free living. Try to anticipate, how am I going to respond to the mistakes, and use these as learning opportunities in the developing process of a young person. Be in the know. By joining this chat tonight, you're taking the effort to try to know some information, continue to be in the know, ask questions, send emails, do research, Google's your friend. Try to know everything you can, because that can be helpful. And if you don't know the place to ask the question, try to find out where you could go. And I think organizations like Richmond Addiction Services or Pathways Clubhouse, these are organizations where, the attitude in Richmond has always been all doors are the right door. So reach out, ask the question, don't be shy. And then remember the big picture, right? In the moment, things are intense and they're exhausting and they're provoking. But the big picture is you see, the forest for the tree. Many youth today experience anxiety, stress, depression, behavior and attitude changes can be a sign of deeper kind of concerns going on in their lives. Find the supports that kids might need if they're struggling, and look at the big picture too from your perspective as a parent. What's your goal? Like, what are you hoping to see happen as a parent? What's proof that you've done your job well? Have you ever considered that? I think this could be a reasonable goal. Like, I want to raise healthy, emotionally resilient youth, young people. Or maybe this is the goal. I want them to have values that connect with their behaviors and that there's kind of a reciprocal process to it. Or maybe your goal is just relationship. I want them to be in my life still once they're old, and I'd like to still have a relationship with them. Or maybe there's other things you add to these goals. But like, what's the big picture goal you have for your young people? Because the day will come where they will fly the coop, they will go, and then our job will be quote unquote done, so to speak. So it's kind of having that in mind as we go through the challenging teenage years. And the last thing I'd suggest too is the valuable oxygen mask metaphor. You get on an airplane and they give you the safety instructions they suggest with oxygen masks. Make sure that if the masks drop, you put your own on and then help the people around you. Don't go trying to put the masks on the people around you and not put yours on first. And it's that idea is like, take care of yourselves. Do what's good for you so you feel like you're taking care of your own wellness, your own well-being. That's how you have true presence with young people, is you're putting on your oxygen mask, you're taking deep breaths. This kind of fits with the window of tolerance. Are you getting air in, right? Are you feeling a little bit more capable to respond to the stressors of life? Because that's going to equip you to help the young people that are near you in your life. And that's it. We'll do some Q&A, but it's a lot of information and it's a lot of talking for me. So thank you for bearing with me. But I hope this is useful and just some useful ideas and commentary on the parenting process, the caregiving process with adolescents. And that my hope is that some of this is something that's going to help you in your experience. And by all means, send me an email if you have questions. And I do have some availability for some intakes for clients right now. So like, hit me up. But I'm excited to do some Q&A right now.